Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us. I'm Jenny Wood. I'm a member of the Board of Directors and Executive Committee at the Atlantic Council. And also I lead the global marketing effort at an asset management firm here in New York called Third Point. I could not be more delighted to introduce today's event. The signing of the Abraham Accords in September 2020 was undoubtedly a watershed moment, both for geopolitical and economic relations in the Middle East. And today we want to take a deeper dive into the Abraham Accords, looking both backward and forward. We hope to explore not only the Accords' historical significance and the unique leadership dynamic that led to this extraordinary formation, but also consider the future and the ability of the Accords to continue to expand and impact the region. Leadership transitions in both the United States and Israel and a pressing set of geopolitical issues will undoubtedly test this relationship. Leading us today in this conversation is Axios diplomatic correspondent Barak Ravid. Barak is one of Israel's most prominent journalists and the author of a new book, Trump's Peace, the Abraham Accords and the Reshaping of the Middle East, which we hope will find its way to the shores of the United States in the not too distant future. Barak has previously worked as a diplomatic correspondent for Channel 13 and the Haaretz newspaper, where he covered the Prime Minister's office, the Foreign Ministry, and the Ministry of Defense. Before joining Haaretz, Barak worked for 2 years at the Ma'ariv daily newspaper, spending a year covering the Palestinian Authority and a year as a diplomatic correspondent. I would be remiss if I didn't mention that he also served in the well-known 8200 Intelligence Division of the Israeli military. Barak, it's an absolute pleasure to have you with us today. And thank you for making time despite the COVID eruption that unfolded in your house last week.
Thanks, Jenny.
Barak will be jointly interviewed by two Middle East experts at the Atlantic Council, Carmiel Arvid and Jonah Fisher. Carmiel is a non-resident senior fellow for Middle East programs at the Atlantic Council and a co-founder of Key Bridge Strategies. She was previously the director of strategic engagement at the American Israel Public Affairs Committee's Office of Policy and Government Affairs, a mouthful, and has also previously worked at Brookings Center for Middle East Policy and the American Jewish Committee. She has been recognized as a top foreign policy influencer by Diplomatic Courier and is a Truman National Security Fellow. Jonah Fisher is the Senior Director of the Millennium Leadership Program at the Atlantic Council. Prior to joining the Council, Jonah was the founding director of Gather, Seeds of Peace social innovation arm, and he spent much of his career in Israel, where he co-founded a co-working business in Tel Aviv and served as the Director of Training and Leadership at one of Israel's leading think tanks, the Reut Institute. As a reminder, this event is on the record and will be recorded. And for those of you joining us live, please submit questions via the chat function on your screen. With that, thanks so much for joining us. And I'll turn things over to Carmiel and Jonah in what I hope will be a fascinating discussion. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Jenny, for kicking us off and for your support of the Atlantic Council's work to advance a more peaceful, prosperous Middle East. Through our partnership with the Jeffrey M. Talpins Foundation, the Council has been on the cutting edge of efforts to deepen and expand normalization, and through Jonah's work to advance leadership. There is perhaps no reporter on the Israeli scene who has examined the confluence of these issues more closely than you, Barak Ravid. And so we are so delighted to have you with us today. I want to jump right into questions because I know the audience is going to have many. Please be sure to leave your questions in the Q&A box. Barak, your new book, which as we noted has made considerable waves despite only having been published in Hebrew so far, includes a deep dive into both Netanyahu and Trump and the events that led to the signing of the Abraham Accords. Tell us, what were the key takeaways that this audience should know about this historic moment in the region? But I also want to know, as someone who has been covering these issues for such a long time, what were the most surprising revelations?
Hi, Carmiel. Thank you for having me here. It's really a pleasure and a privilege to speak to the Atlantic Council. And to your question, I think, when I wrote the book, I'll start with something like on a personal note. When I started writing the book, I said, I don't even know if people still read books these days. It's like, who knows? And then I said, you know what? I don't care if they read it or not. I think for me, it felt like you said it, I mean, people say it again and again, use this, watershed moment and things like that. But it was really like that for me personally, as someone who covered this for so many years. And all of a sudden, I saw all of the things that I worked on actually happening. Because for many, many years, I covered the Middle East peace process and nothing was happening, at least nothing good. So I thought this is the biggest breakthrough in Middle East peace process in the last generation, the last 25 years. And I said, I want to be the first one to write the full story of how the Abraham Accords happened. And I want to write it in its fullest and most detailed version. So I started last December, really right after the agreement with Morocco was signed, the last one out of those 4 agreements. And actually, writing the book was sort of, I was reliving those whole few months, and it was, it just, I think, convinced me even more that the significance of the Abraham Accords is because it was really the biggest breakthrough in Middle East peace process in the last 25 years.
Hi, Barak. I want to jump in here and speak a bit about leadership. The book speaks a lot about Trump and Netanyahu's leadership in the formation of these accords. Reflecting on their relationship, what can we learn about their respective styles as leaders? And how might that have helped and or hurt the formation of the accords?
Yeah.
And now that there's new administrations left in their wake, how might the new administrations continue the legacy of this transnational alliance?
Yeah, that's also connects to what Carmiel asked before, because this was one of the things that was most surprising to me. Because for for the last 4 years, or for the 4 years of the Trump administration, we all thought that Trump and Netanyahu were best buds, that it was a bromance. And apparently, while working on the book and interviewing people from both sides, especially, Trump himself and all of his advisors, I just found out that this whole thing was, to be undiplomatic, it was bullshit. Because basically, it was very convenient for both Netanyahu and Trump, for their own domestic political reasons, to show that they're, best friends and that there's no daylight between them, because it was good for Trump's conservative evangelical base, and it was good for Netanyahu's right-wing and ultra-Orthodox base, because they're both like the other guy. And in reality, behind the surface, behind what they told us, behind the billboards with the huge Trump and Bibi pictures, behind the press conferences, behind the smiles, the press releases, there was something completely different. And so when to your question about leadership, I call the book Trump's Peace, and many people ask me, "Why do you call it Trump's Peace? What's the problem?" Obviously, mostly from people who don't really like Trump. And I think, and I write it in the book, Trump wasn't into the details of the Abraham Accords. Okay, let's be honest. He didn't know he didn't know what was actually written there. But he was, and I write it also in the book, without Trump, if there was another president in the White House at that time, I'm not sure the Abraham Accords would have been possible. And I think so for 3 reasons. First reason is because of Trump's policy in the region. Like it or not, some people think it was good, some people think it was bad. I'm not, I'm not discussing his actual policy, but I'm just saying that his policy decisions, the result of them was that both Israel and the Gulf states felt closer to the administration. The trust gap that was open during the Obama administration closed down, and also Israel and the Gulf states got even closer together because of Trump's foreign policy decisions. That's reason number 1. Reason number 2 is that the people Trump appointed to deal with this file especially Jared Kushner, who's, he got a lot of criticism in the US. People said it was nepotism, he's appointing his son-in-law. I'm not getting into this discussion. I'm just telling you that here in the region, both in the Arab world and in Israel, that made sense to a lot of people. And it got them to feel that when they speak to the envoy, they speak to the president. And I think if everything would have failed, then people would say, oh, look, Trump, you appointed your son-in-law and, you failed. It was obvious. But when it succeeds, then Trump deserves a lot of credit because it's his, almost his own flesh and blood that he appointed to deal with this file. And third, Trump did something that I'm not sure Hillary Clinton would have done. And we can see right now that Biden is still not doing. And this is that he put his hand into his pocket and took out tangible things to give many countries in the region in order to make them take this last step and pass this Rubicon from having no relations with Israel or having a clandestine relationship with Israel to having a peace agreement with Israel. The UAE got F-35s, Bahrain got some trade benefits, Morocco, the Western Sahara, Sudan, a big aid package, and they were taken out of the State Department's state sponsors of terrorism list. So each got something. And without that, without those decisions by Trump and his willingness to give those countries something, I'm not sure the agreements would happen. So I think when you talk about leadership, okay, regardless of the fact that Trump, again, he knew that those are peace agreements. He didn't know every word in the agreement, but his decisions and his appointments got this thing to happen. So I think it tells you a lot about how leaders influence things at the end. And I also think, and it made me think a lot about both Trump, but more about Netanyahu, because it's pretty same, the feeling about Trump in America and the feeling about Netanyahu in Israel. It's either you love him or you hate him. It's either you think he's a Messiah or he's God, or you think he's the devil. And what the book taught me about leadership, and especially about heads of state, is that, and politicians, is that it's always more complicated, okay? Both the people who hate Trump's guts and both the people that put him on a pedestal need to realize that it's not that simple. Things are more complicated. Trump did very bad stuff, but he also did good stuff. And Netanyahu did very bad stuff, but he also did great stuff. And every legacy of every leader is more complex and is made out of bad decisions and out of good decisions. And when we, especially if you want to take a real serious look at it with intellectual honesty, we have to agree that we can't just say, oh, we're just focusing on all the bad stuff someone did. So, and I say it both on Trump, and I say it, and here it's something that is more close to my heart, because at the end of the day, I don't vote in America, I don't pay taxes in America, I'm an Israeli citizen, I vote here. And I say it to myself about Netanyahu, someone who I criticized a lot in the last 12 years, but while writing the book, I realized that he also deserves credit for a lot of things, especially building this relationship with the Arab world that was the infrastructure that allowed the Abraham Accords to take place.
Thank you for that very sober reflection on both administrations that tend to drive real passionate views. I'd be curious to transition from the look back to a look at the present. There are now new governments in Jerusalem and in Washington, and new leaders have become the custodians of an agreement that they inherited. I would be very interested in your take on how both the Israeli government and the Biden administration are approaching the accords, and perhaps even compare it a bit to how their predecessors did.
I think that, there was a lot of concern about what will happen with the Abraham Accords after Biden won the election. And then there was a lot of concern what will happen to the accords after Netanyahu left office here in Israel, and there was a new government. And what we saw is that the transition of power in both the US and Israel did not change a thing. And the real reason that it didn't change a thing, and it also connects to the question about leadership, is that at the end of the day, the Emiratis, and especially Crown Prince of Abu Dhabi, Mohammed bin Zayed, he went for this as a real strategic long-term decision. It wasn't like, there were those political circumstances, he wanted to get something from Trump, or he did like this deal with Bibi. No, it was a strategic decision to go for a relationship, a long-term relationship, a deep relationship, a strategic one with Israel. And when the Biden administration came into office, we saw for a few months something that to me was very strange, because Biden, when he was still candidate during the campaign, he praised the Abraham Accords. He issued a statement saying that it was a great development and that he supports it. But and in private, when he spoke to both Netanyahu and Mohammed bin Zayed after coming into office, he said the same things in private. But in public, the Biden administration, almost until the summer, okay, so like for 7 or 8 months, the Biden administration projected a very cold approach towards the Abraham Accords. For example, the name Abraham Accords wasn't used in public. It was amazing. They called it the normalization agreements. And only when we got to the 1-year anniversary, something happened. It was like somebody switched on the light. Really, like in one day, the Biden administration decided, okay, we need to embrace this. And they did, both in public, and I think that since somewhere August, September, they also did much more, on the ground in trying to strengthen the accords and to push for new ones. And what was, kind of funny is that when the new government in Israel was formed, not everybody, but Prime Minister Bennett, it took him some time to understand that he should embrace the Abraham Accords. Because I remember how there was the 1-year anniversary. It was September 15th, 1-year anniversary for the signing of the Abraham Accords, and it was Yom Kippur Eve in Israel. And I remember I was tweeting that Bennett didn't say anything yet about the Abraham Accords at all. Not about the anniversary, not about the accords at all, since he's prime minister for 3 months. And I remember getting a phone call from one of his aides telling me, don't you think you are too emotionally attached to the Abraham Accords? And I told him, well, I don't know about myself, but it seems that you're too much emotionally detached from the Abraham Accords. And I think they also went through this, evolution until they understood that for them, it's not embracing the Abraham Accords doesn't mean that, they should not embrace the Abraham Accords only because it's part of Netanyahu's legacy. And I think so on both sides, in the Biden administration and in the Bennett government, it took them a while to, put politics aside. By the way, not everybody in the Israeli government thought like that. Yair Lapid, the foreign minister, he went to Abu Dhabi to inaugurate the Israeli embassy 2 weeks after the government was formed. It was an amazing trip. I was there. And basically, he was the first Israeli minister to officially and publicly visit the UAE, because Netanyahu didn't allow anybody to go there until he goes, when he was still prime minister. And every time he postponed his trip. And so no Israeli ministers went to the UAE for quite some time, for almost 9 months. And Lapid went there 2 weeks after he assumed office. And since then, many ministers went.
Following on the thread around the new governments, it seems like the accord was built between Netanyahu and Trump almost personally. As you mentioned, Kushner and Trump's kind of flesh was part of the creation of this accord. These new governments, we have a coalition government in Israel and a Democratic Party that's very diverse in its perspectives. How might these more diverse parties and coalitions carry this agreement forward, and what complexities might await them?
So first, I got to tell you about your first comment. This is what Netanyahu wanted a lot of people to think, that he and Trump did this whole thing on their own. Not true, okay? When the Abraham Accords were negotiated, we need to remember that. When the negotiations about the Abraham Accords started on July 2nd, 2020, okay? July 1st was supposed to be annexation day, the day that Netanyahu starts annexing parts of the West Bank. And this was Netanyahu's top priority, to annex parts of the West Bank, not to go for a normalization with the UAE. And the normalization agreement with the UAE was, at the end of the day, the ladder that Mohammed bin Zayed gave the White House in order to get Bibi down from the annexation tree. So it was, as I said at the beginning, it was much, much more complex than what Netanyahu wanted all of us to think. And about the Democrats and the current coalition in Israel, I think there's, ironically enough, the main constituency for the Abraham Accords should have been, liberals, both in America and in Israel, that support peace in the Middle East. And in a weird twist of history, the fact that Trump and Netanyahu were the ones to sign the agreements got many liberals and Democrats in America and many center-left people here in Israel to keep distance from this, and to find all those weird reasons why it's not a good development. I was amazed here in Israel that people on the left found amazing reasons why this is not a good development. One of the reasons was, which again I was kind of baffled to hear this, it's an autocratic country, it's not a democracy, so what's it's just a deal with some autocrats in the Gulf. And I asked all those people, can you point me to all the liberal democracies in the region that we can make peace with? Because I'm looking very hard and I just can't find any. And last time I checked, there aren't any other than Israel. So if we're going to wait for peace until the Middle East will be full of liberal democracies, I got to tell you, I think we'll have to wait quite some time. So I think that's, if there's one thing that I hope that will change, and it starts changing, at least here in Israel, with the new coalition that people both from the Labor Party and from Meretz, that it's the most liberal and left-wing parts of the political system, they're getting involved in the Abraham Accords. They're going to the UAE, they're going to Bahrain, they're going to Morocco, they're starting to connect. And I'm really happy this is happening.
I think you raised some interesting points here, both about criticisms, but also the fact that you mentioned Meretz. And I just want to pick up on this. There had long been the notion that peace with the Palestinians, a top priority for the Meretz Party, was going to be the pathway for Israel to normalization. And the Abraham Accords have really upended that conventional wisdom. And so I would be very curious, in your view, a couple of things. Is the peace process now dead? Is there going to still be an opportunity to revive some kind of dialogue for the Palestinians, who have been among the strongest critics of this agreement? Are there things that the Palestinian leadership can be doing to try to capitalize on these new developments? and what they feel has been up until now really a betrayal by their neighbors.
Well, first, I got to tell you, yes, the Palestinian reaction to the Abraham Accords was very, very negative. I think it was a big mistake on their part. It didn't get them anywhere. I remember how the Palestinians brought back their ambassador from Abu Dhabi, and then brought back their ambassador from Manama, from Bahrain. And then when Sudan and Morocco happened, they stopped bringing back their ambassadors because they realized that at this rate, they would be totally cutting themselves out from the rest of the Arab world. And I think that, when it comes to the Israeli-Palestinian peace process, the reason that it's frozen, unfortunately, is because of domestic politics, both in Israel and in Palestine. Both sides, unfortunately, are not in a place where they can take the big decisions needed for a peace agreement. And again, it's very unfortunate, but Netanyahu, during those 12 years, only wanted to maintain the status quo. President Abbas on the Palestinian side, unfortunately, also mainly wanted to maintain the status quo. The political situation in Palestine is that of a very deep political crisis. The Palestinian political system is dysfunctional. It's divided between Fatah and Hamas, between Gaza and the West Bank. The elections are canceled again and again and again. You have millions of people that didn't have the ability to elect their leaders, their legitimate leaders, for years. If there's one thing, when you ask Palestinians, what's the one thing that they want elections in order to be able to, again, to elect their leaders. It's Abbas is in his, 17th year of a 4-year term. That's like, and this joke, we sang this joke for like 15 years now, because, it just keeps on and on and on. And I think that in order for the peace process to be revived, there needs to be, big political changes on both sides. On the Israeli side, by the way, I think the political change that occurred did create some opening with the Palestinians. If you look today, in the last 6 months, there was more engagement between Israel and the Palestinian Authority than in the previous 13 years. Just in the last 6 months, 2 meetings between President Abbas and Minister of Defense Gantz, at least a dozen meetings between Palestinian and Israeli ministers. The Israeli and Palestinian ministers of health did not meet for 10 years. They didn't even meet during COVID until there was a new government in Israel, okay? And this new government relaunched the healthcare dialogue, which is kind of important these days. And I think that you see that Israel actually took quite a lot of steps to try and strengthen the Palestinian Authority. And I think it's also, again, it's still building in the settlements, but I think when you look at the numbers are, decreased quite a lot from the Trump-Netanyahu era. So I think that all in all, in the last 6 months, there's a good trend between Israel and the Palestinians. It doesn't mean that there's going to be negotiations, final status negotiations, but there are tons of stuff to do, even short of peace talks. And with the point that you started, I got to tell you, I myself was one of those who thought, and I told this to Netanyahu numerous times. I told him, look, you got no clue about what you're talking about. The Arab countries will never normalize with Israel before there's some progress with the Palestinians. And you know what? He was right. I was wrong. And, I write it in the book too. And by the way, I'm glad that he was right, because, again, I think that the Abraham Accords were a great development. And by the way, a lot of people are saying, the Palestinians were betrayed. I want to remind you something. Without the Abraham Accords, Netanyahu most likely would have annexed parts of the West Bank, which would most likely, totally kill the two-state solution for good. And after the Abraham Accords, during the last Gaza war, the Emiratis, the Bahrainis, the Moroccans put quite a lot of pressure on Israel to stop the war. And I'm not saying this was the reason that they stopped it after 10 days, but I think it also had some influence. So, and I think there's still a lot of potential for the Palestinians in the Abraham Accords if they decide to, again, first they need to normalize their relations with the UAE. That's another problem. But I think they have a lot of potential there if they decide to join.
I think I just want to pick up on some of the points that you made, including, one of the key things the UAE had said was central to their signing this agreement was that they were able to prevent annexation. And I think that's a really interesting analysis about shortening the Gaza war due to pressure from these countries. I would be curious, looking forward, what other opportunities, which you also mentioned, you think exist, and maybe even responsibility for these Arab countries who have said that supporting the Palestinian people remains a central objective for them. I'll note there are a number of Arab ambassadors from those normalized countries who are on this call right now. And so I would be curious sort of what you see they have the potential to do.
First, again, as I said, I think they already did. Because again, what they did, I'll give you an example, okay? I heard it from former Foreign Minister Gabi Ashkenazi, who told me that he spoke to Abdallah bin Zayed, the Emirati foreign minister. He spoke to him 6 times during those 10 days of Gaza war. That's quite a lot. And more or less the same number of calls with the Bahrainis and with the Moroccans. And again, it had an influence. And I think that the more those agreements, if they'll get, not if, I think they will get stronger and stronger. And any government in Israel, when it thinks, okay, you know what, I want to annex again parts of the West Bank, those, the Abraham Accords will be quite a big reminder for any Israeli government that, it should think twice before it does, crazy stuff in the West Bank or in Gaza. And I think it's because those relationships, new relationships, are very important to Israel, both diplomatically, but also on trade, economy, tourism, 250,000 of Israelis went to the UAE in the last year. This means that every 10th family in Israel was somehow touched by the Abraham. So now think whether an Israeli prime minister, he would think, okay, what's going to happen if Israelis can't go to Dubai anymore because of some policy decision I've made? I'm not saying this is the number one thing that would influence a decision of a prime minister, but it's a big factor because it's a kind of relationship that will just become stronger and stronger and stronger. Maybe more countries will join, and I think it will influence the decision-making of Israeli leaders for decades to come.
So we took a small tour to the UAE, Morocco, Bahrain, speaking about their leaders, and of course about the role of Bennett and Lapid in the Israeli government these days. Coming back to DC, where we're calling in from, the US government played a very large role in birthing the accord. You mentioned that Biden's government seemed hesitant in ushering the accord forward. What is the role the US should play bringing this accords into the future?
Yeah, again, it was hesitant. I think, again, from September, there's a big change. They're much more into it. They picked up this ball, and now the question is, are they going to take it over the finish line? Right now, I think the Biden administration can do much more, but it takes political decisions. I'll give you one example. Saudi Arabia, that's the classic example, okay? Jake Sullivan, the national security advisor, went to Saudi Arabia and raised the issue of normalization with MBS, with Mohammed bin Salman. And Mohammed bin Salman told him, you know what, I think it's a great idea. I'm not against normalization with Israel, but I have, few conditions. And most of those conditions had nothing to do with normalization with Israel. They had to do with normalization with the US. And this is, as you all know, is a very hard decision for Biden to make. Basically, what the Saudis are asking for is for Biden to normalize Mohammed bin Salman in Washington. And this is a very, very, very difficult decision. But if Biden takes it, I think there's a very good chance that the Saudis will join the Abraham Accords. And if the Saudis join the Abraham Accords, then most likely, very shortly after, you'll have Indonesia there. And then shortly after, you'll have Kuwait, and you'll have Oman, and you'll have many other countries. And then basically, a big part of the Israeli-Arab conflict is over. You'll still have the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, obviously, but this is, this could be a great foreign policy achievement for Biden. But again, as I said, it takes decisions, and I'm still not sure how much the Biden administration, that also, has quite a lot of things on its plate. Ukraine, Russia, China, climate, Iran, a lot of other things. But I think that the Biden administration can do more. It started doing things, it can do more than it's doing today. I think that one of the main problems is that when you ask, who's the point man in the Biden administration on the Abraham Accords? Nobody knows. Nobody knows. And you know why? Because there are like 3 or 4 people that want to be this person. But those people also have 10,000 other files on their desk. And I think that what is needed is a very, very clear point man in the Biden administration that can strengthen the current agreements and push for more agreements.
Thank you, Barak. We're going to open up the floor to some questions from the audience. We have a few questions flowing in here in the chat. Carmiel, do you want to take the first one?
I'm on mute, apologies. Yes, one of the first questions that we have focuses specifically on Iran and Iran's role. You have argued that the nuclear threat posed by Tehran was one of the factors that contributed to the signing of these accords. 1 year on, how have the accords affected this? How has this new regional alliance affected Iranian behavior in the region? And I would be curious to know as well how you think the international community's response to Iran has been affected by the signing of these accords.
I got to tell you that, when I wrote the book, when I started writing the book, I really thought that Iran was, a main factor. It is a factor, obviously, but I thought that it was much bigger than I discovered it is. Because what I found is that Iran, there's an alliance against Iran between Israel and the Gulf states. Iran is a mutual threat. Everything is true, but the reasons for the UAE and other countries to normalize with Israel are much, much, much broader than Iran, and it has to do with economy, with technology, and even with changing how people in the region think. Okay, and And I think that for Mohammed bin Zayed, for example, normalizing with Israel was part of a much broader process of creating, changes and reforms inside the UAE. It was almost a domestic thing. And so I think that, Iran is a factor, but it's not, I'm not even sure it's number one. I'm not even sure it's number two. Maybe it's number three for those countries. But I think that what we saw as part of the Abraham Accords when it comes to Iran was that one of the main changes was that Israel was moved from EUCOM to CENTCOM, area of responsibility. And this all of a sudden created all those avenues, new avenues for operationalizing the Abraham Accords. And then you saw all of a sudden Israel and the Gulf states in a joint Navy exercise in the Red Sea. And you see much more cooperation on security. And you see now after the Houthi attacks on Abu Dhabi, you see how Israel, the US, and the UAE are working together now on how to enhance Emirati early warning and detection capabilities and how to share intelligence on missile attacks. And so I think that we can see every day how the Abraham Accords also influence the Iranian issue. And there were a lot of concerns in Israel in recent weeks that the UAE started this dialogue with Iran and what it would do to the Abraham Accords. And then we saw 2 visits by Prime Minister Bennett and President Herzog just the other day in the UAE. So I think that as much as the UAE is working to de-escalate with Iran, it's not at the expense of the Abraham Accords at all.
We have a question coming from recent headlines around Pegasus. Pegasus has been making headlines around the impact it's been having across the globe recently, this Israeli technology company. The New York Times reported that Pegasus played a critical role in the Abraham Accords. What can you tell us about that? How critical was this as a carrot for these governments?
I got to tell you that again, as far as I know, and by the way, in the New York Times report, there was I didn't see, a very concrete piece of information that connects the Abraham Accords to NSO or to Pegasus. It was more like this atmosphere. And I have to tell you that the Abraham Accords themselves, as far as I know, had nothing to do with, Pegasus or anything like that. NSO sold Pegasus to the UAE many, many years before the Abraham Accords with a license from the Israeli Ministry of Defense. So many, many years before anybody even thought about normalizing relations with Israel. And again, I'm not saying that the Abraham Accords are not going to enhance security cooperation, intelligence cooperation. They obviously will, but Israel would have sold Pegasus to Israel, not Israel, NSO, with an Israeli license, Israeli government license. They would sell it to countries in the region regardless of the Abraham Accords. Let's say there were no Abraham Accords today, and Morocco or Bahrain or the UAE would ask to buy, an updated version of Pegasus, they would get a license. It's not, so I don't think, it's connected in any way.
Great. Thank you for that. Another question from the audience, and this is several questions rolled together, but I think they relate enough. I'll give them all to you. And the first is whether or not Israel is for or against the sale of F-35 stealth jets to the UAE. And staying on the thread of military implications, is it not a big step that Israel is now part of US CENTCOM and not, say, US European Command? Isn't Israel now engaging in joint military exercises with Arab forces? Are these things that the Biden administration can and should be claiming credit for?
First, Israel was moved to CENTCOM during the Trump administration. The Biden administration is, again, operationalizing this. It's great that it's doing it. But just, on a factual basis, the credit for moving Israel from EUCOM to CENTCOM is for the Trump administration. About the F-35s, well, I'm sure, or I know that the Israeli defense establishment would have been much happier if the UAE didn't get F-35s, okay? Because, they want Israel to be the only country in the region that has this very, very sophisticated fighter jet. Saying that, I don't think that there's any concern, any real concern in the Israeli defense establishment right now from this sale. I think that Israel and the US reached an agreement on how to move this deal forward without jeopardizing Israel's qualitative military edge. It has to do with certain systems that I think that the F-35s that the Emiratis are getting is not going to have, certain technological systems. And so I think that today, if you ask people like a year later, whether anybody in the Israeli military or defense establishment is concerned by this, I don't think so.
We have a number of questions in the chat here around the Palestinian question, particularly regarding annexation. And the fact that annexation was held off due to the Abraham Accords being created. Where does that stand in the long term? What happens if Israel re-explores annexation? How will that affect these accords? How does that dance play out between these countries?
So first, there were many people who told me, this whole annexation thing, it was just a trick. It's part of Bibi's magic. Bibi is this modern day Machiavelli that manages to spin the entire world on his finger. And he just made up this whole annexation thing because he knew that it will get the Arab countries to normalize, so he's a genius. Well, that's a great story. Only problem is not true. Netanyahu, the annexation was not a spin, okay? Netanyahu wanted to move ahead with annexation at the end of June, when the White House envoy Avi Berkowitz came to Israel to ask Netanyahu for deliverables for the Palestinians in return for annexation. Netanyahu said no. And then Berkowitz told him, so we will not support this. So Netanyahu said, so I will go at it alone, on my own, unilaterally. And then Berkowitz threatened that Trump will tweet against him, and then Netanyahu cooled down. But Netanyahu considered seriously to move for annexations without a green light from the US. And only at a certain point, he realized that it's too risky, and he didn't do it. And right now, I got to tell you, since August 13th, 2020, when the annexation was taken off the table, nobody's talking about this. It's like it's a dead concept. It's like, our current prime minister is someone who was talking about annexation of 60% of the West Bank, not only 30% of the West Bank like Netanyahu wanted. 60% of the West Bank. That was Bennett's plan several years ago. Since he's prime minister, that's it. It's like it doesn't exist. You ask Bennett about annexation, he asks you, annexation? Are you crazy? What are you talking about? So no one's talking about it. It doesn't mean that it can't come up again. There are several people in America that would love this to come up again if, in the future, especially only from the Republican Party, certain politicians that will try to push this if there's a Republican president in the White House. But I have to tell you that, again, at the moment, I see no appetite here for doing such a thing.
A quick follow-up there. If it's not annexation, are there any other red lines that if they were to be crossed, this accord would fall apart?
Well, I thought that the last Gaza war could cool down the Abraham Accords and it was the perfect. If Morocco, Sudan, Bahrain, and the UAE wanted to cool down things, the Gaza war was the perfect excuse for that. And then the war ended, and not only did they not cool down the Abraham Accords, they warmed it up, and since then the Abraham Accords have just strengthened. So again, I think a Gaza war could always create a crisis that would lead to the breakup of the Abraham Accords. The Gaza war in 2008 got Qatar to cut ties with Israel. So there are precedents for that. The Second Intifada got Morocco and Mauritania and Oman and Tunisia and other countries to cut ties with Israel. So again, a big crisis with the Palestinians is always will always be a very, very big challenge for the Abraham Accords.
We have another question here about Iran, the million-dollar question, if you will. Will Israel press for a military attack if the JCPOA talks with the Iranians end without an agreement?
If it ends without an agreement. Well, Israel is already pushing for some sort of credible military option that the Biden administration will introduce. I don't see that at least not imminently. In the next 6 to 12 months, Israel doesn't have a credible military option of its own. The political crisis in Israel in the last 2 years basically, froze all the training and the build-up for a possible military strike against Iran. So now it starts again. It takes time to train, to build up capabilities, to gather intelligence. So I don't see any imminent military option.
We have time for one last question. I want to apologize for all the great questions that haven't yet been answered. Hopefully we'll do this again down the road and integrate more of those questions. But just a closing remark from you, Barak. Where do things stand moving forward? You mentioned Saudi Arabia, Indonesia, other countries joining in, perhaps. What's the next 5 years hold for us here?
Again, I think there's still a lot of potential. This is something that if the Biden administration first term ends without more normalization agreements, this will be, in my opinion, a failure, because the potential is there. Many countries are ready, but there needs to be an active American role. Okay, it's not enough, and it's not enough just to tell people, oh, what do you think about normalization? It needs active diplomacy by the US with tangible deliverables to the countries in the region. And I think that especially when the Biden administration wants to change its posture in the Middle East and change the way it deals with the Middle East, the Abraham Accords provide a framework for doing that. And I think it's worth it for the Biden administration to pursue this thing. Again, the potential is there, but again, as you said at the beginning, a lot of it is about leadership.
Thank you, Barak. Thank you so much for your remarks today. I think we're out of time for the day, so I'm just going to close this out. I want to thank all those who joined us today. Thanks again for the thoughtful questions. Thank you to Jenny Wood for the generous introductory remarks. Of course, to Barak Ravid for your insights around the Abraham Accords. We look forward to working with you down the road at the Council as we continue working in this arena. I'm excited to share that my program, the Millennium Leadership Program, will be visiting Israel and Palestine in May, hoping to meet with you and others to learn more about what's happening on the ground following this recent change in policy. And our hope across the board is that this is a new chapter ahead of us that brings peace, justice, and prosperity to all. So thank you so much. Have a good rest of the day.
Thank you very much.